What I'm going to do today, sorry, is give a little background on neurons and brain to provide a perspective on the discussion. We won't go into a lot of detail, but we don't want to be vague in our thinking. We'll move on to materialism, the properties of matter and what is explainable by our current notions of matter, and then move on to what mind can do. What are the properties, what are the capabilities, and in particular, if they are derivable or can be extrapolated back to materialism. If you find a little time, we'll comment also on insights which can be provided by quantum mechanics and the efforts of people to see if mind properties are relevant to that, and then summarize a little bit. So we all know about the famous philosopher, René Descartes. One thing and only one thing was he absolutely sure about, and that was that he is real, that he is self-aware. And this is a bit of a problem for materialists because what does that mean to perceive, to know something? There are many theories that go from one extreme of absolute materialism that would even deny there is such a thing as a thinking mind or even will, or for that matter, an identity. And other theories that go to the other end, that there are two separate things that interact. We won't go into all these details, but we are interested in whether strict naturalism, materialism could provide an answer. The most common view among neuroscientists today is identity theory, that in some manner, the brain is the mind. And so people like Karl Marx and B.F. Skinner, the philosopher Dennett, these are all people that claim that. So, and we wish to put things in a bit of perspective to analyze this. Here is a partial picture of a brain fly. 25,000 neurons, 20 million synapses. This is only part of the brain. So, to put things in perspective, you see how complex this is, 25,000. Try to imagine 10 billion neurons for humans and over 100 trillion synapses in our brains. Let's look a little bit on neurons. There are different kinds of neurons. Some are responsible for sensory input, whether it's touch, sound, light, and so on. Others are motor neurons responsible for motion. We have interneurons which connect things. Now, we all begin life as a fertilized cell. Cells go through a process of differentiation, very, very complex. Through this process, eventually we're going to end up where we want to be in today's discussion, dendritic cells. So each lineage here splits up in other lineages that are very, very different. They're visually different, and the particular genes that are activated and deactivated are very, very different. So all this is very, very, very carefully regulated, and as an ensemble, they all provide the services necessary for organs to work. The neurons, which are found in the nervous system, in particular the brain, come in many sizes, shapes, and forms. Here is a general picture of a neuron. As always, we have the nucleus here where the DNA is contained, all the other organelles, which are not being shown here, mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, all those things. What is unique here is this long axon here, very, very long, and these dendrites, and there are thousands of these dendrites. What is interesting is at the end of these dendrites, one neuron can interact with another one, and the interaction point here is called a synapse. And here is where neurotransmitters are transferred. And so there is this network of interactions between neurons. And this is all part of the information processing involved. Very, very complex. We have the sheath here, which are protected by glial cells, and this permits transmission of current much more effectively, also prevents leakage outside the environment of the cells. 100 billion, very, very complicated, about 250,000 produced per minute during the 9 months in utero. And all this is organized into 6 layers in the brain. You can imagine the potential here of utter and complete chaos if this thing is not very, very, very precisely regulated. Some neurons can activate or deactivate others through the interactions here at the synapses. Important is that these neurotransmitters come in more than 60 kinds. These are molecules that are synthesized in the cells. They're manufactured. They're not brought in. Some are fragments or degradation products of, say, proteins and other things. But you think of these as very, very careful signal transmitters. The brain has a structure. Different portions contain neurons specialized to support various processes. We won't go into all these details today. But all this has to be regulated and prepared as part of a child's development and our development also later in life. During pregnancy and afterwards, there's a constant rearrangement of these neurons. They are moved all over the place so that those that perform similar functions are close together. There is a very complex structure here. All this with a very well choreographed timing, very carefully planned. So it turns out that in the case of sensory, in particular sensory neurons, they are linked to specific patches or pieces of tissue on our body. So if your fingertip is touching something, this signal is transmitted. And since the parts of the fingers are receiving the signal, they can transmit the different neurons that can then be brought together. So if you fire together, you're brought together. And this is part of the learning, especially in the case of motoric type activities. So reflexes, like a fly can have a reflex, it's a little bit of a movement very rapidly, it flies off with no thinking, it's a reflex. These are the kinds of learning that occur in a motoric sense. You may have seen these kinds of pictures. When you look at what neurons are activated, what different body parts are activated either by movement or by sense of perception, then you get these kinds of interesting little drawings. You see that, let's take lips here, that quite a few neurons are involved in moving it and also in perceiving it. So here you got the sensory map, here you got the motor map. And that's how people came up with these kind of funny little drawings. So what's interesting is the size of the body part does not correlate with the number of neurons dedicated to them. And the topology of the relationship between the body parts does not reflect very well either where the neurons are located in the brain. So we see here that the neurons involved in the thumb are located very closely to the head. This is not fixed. It's not identical for every person. This is why sometimes you get the phenomena that some people can see various, or they can hear various colors, or they can see certain numbers. When they see a number 9, then they perceive a color. It's because the neurons here are very close together and have entered into the areas dedicated to the other sensory duties. So these brains are very plastic. That means that if you injure one part, they can be repaired. And portions of the brain that were used for one thing can be used for entirely different things as a process in the process of healing. So there's a constant rearrangement. Memory is probably not stored in one fixed place, but is shifted around. So how do we know this? Well, the different techniques. A lot of times, neurosurgeons simply evaluate what happens when certain illness or accidents occur. Let's say you had a stroke. They notice certain body parts can't be moved. They correlate this to the brain and then try to figure out what is responsible for what functions. Many experiments are done on humans, many done on non-humans, and there's a series of techniques here involving amount of blood, movement, radioactive dyes, or electromagnetic resonance. And these are linked to experiments, like people are asked to perform certain motor activities or to visualize or look at certain things. And then the scientists monitor the visual feedback and then try to map things together. That's where this information is coming from. So in summary, a very short summary, neurons in the brain, extraordinarily complex, everything very precisely regulated, all deriving ultimately from a single fertilized cell. Now, our question today is, can we explain this in natural terms so we see? Materialism, matter. Matter has certain very fundamental properties: mass, volume, movement, momentum. These are things that we know, certain forces. From this, we can derive other properties. Things like rotations and vibrations are possible once several elements, like several particles or several atoms, are put together. Then you get other derived properties. But the message is they derive seamlessly. It's easy to understand the derived property because it makes sense. Moving on, as you add more and more molecules, you can understand or see additional properties, things like fluidity and viscosity or pressure, phase separation, and let's say among liquids or solids. These are things, but once again, they derived from the underlying causal features. So although they are interesting and everything else, they are comprehensible, nothing fundamentally new is happening. And sometimes under special conditions, you do get breaks, meaning that you see trends. You can look at viscosity as a function of temperature. It shows sort of a curved behavior. And under special conditions, you could see a break, or in the case of water, it suddenly freezes or evaporates, or you mix acids and bases, and you see that what you obtain here is interesting and at first glance, not expected. But in reality, I maintain that the so-called emergent properties are derivable and understandable from the underlying causal features. So in the case of water here, as you increase the heat, you see a certain rate of increase in temperature. This rate is a bit different if it's a solid or a liquid. At the freezing point, you don't see an increase in temperature because certain molecular things are happening internally. The same is true also during evaporation. But the key point here is nothing fundamentally different is happening because we're always talking about things like mass, volume, and things like that. And that's important because it is precisely this word emergence that scientists, especially those that haven't thought about this very carefully, claim explains the origin of an existence of mind. They say that if you have enough matter in the right configuration, that you get new properties. Yeah, you get new properties, but I'm saying that's not relevant to the discussion of mind. Why? Well, there's several reasons. First, the emergent properties, interesting as they may be, are always derived or fundamental properties. You're just looking at a different kind of movement, whether it's oscillation or anything like that. It's still movement, it's still mass, it's nothing fundamentally different. It is indeed true that if you know the properties of hydrogen and oxygen, at first glance, it seems strange that you're getting water until you start including additional properties that are already present, the various forces. Then you see that the distribution of electrons leading to molecular orbitals are the explanations for water. So fundamentally, what is happening? Well, you've got mass, movement, you've got electrical forces. It's just how they interact and how you describe them could be interesting and indeed emergent, but not fundamentally different. Now, let's look though at physical objects. Let's say you're looking at chess pieces on a board or pieces in a backgammon game. And now you want to limit yourself to these fundamental properties and make a prediction. Where are those chess pieces going to be in 5 minutes? You have a problem. Or working backwards, how did the chess pieces get there the way they were? You could have the exact same chess pieces at 2 locations or 2 different times, and depending on who's playing and moving and intelligently interacting, the pieces are found in different places. So you don't have a deterministic kind of behavior that we see in matter. So this intelligent agency is around us everywhere. We cannot ignore this. We cannot try to explain the origin of computers and computer programs through material properties. And this idea of qualia, that we sense and perceive things. This is not something that is explainable in any manner. Philosophers call this a category error. If you want to understand music and somebody is spending their whole life analyzing gravity, you're not going to get the answer of how music works or how you perceive music. It's a category error. You're barking up the wrong tree. So if you want to understand how you are able to perceive the redness that you're looking at, this redness, this feeling, this perception, it doesn't matter how you reorganize location of particles or their movement, you're not going to arrive at perceptions of category error. So let's look now at some mind properties. And this, I hope, will be an interesting discussion because it's very conceptual and very intuitive. It does not require a great deal of background. And this is something that we all participate in, these kinds of mindful activities. On the left-hand side, just refresh your memory. These are the kinds of fundamental properties that are available as explanatory elements from a material point of view, okay? Just to keep that in mind. And now let's look at the things that mind can do. In general terms, let's say that you perceive something. This can be an external object, or maybe you perceive that you have a thought. You are aware of something. Now, very, very, very quickly, many things seem to be occurring simultaneously. The thing that you're perceiving, you can consider in a rapid abstract manner. You don't have to consider fine details. You can think in general terms. You have categories. This is an animal. This is part of a formal conversation. You have a will. How do you want to interact with the thing that you are perceiving? This is very much affected by your emotions. Depending on the will and your emotions, you can devise a strategy. What do I do with this? This strategy allows me to focus my attention and my resources. I can integrate it with other objects nearby or other thoughts, other features. I can integrate all this in abstract sense. And all this is going on very, very, very rapidly, holistically, coherently, every time I perceive something. Now, that's a lot to digest. Let's say, for example, that I perceive a fire alarm. So I am aware of that. And the fire alarm here, it could be anything. In this case, it's audio, but it could be something as smelling or hearing as multimedia. Now, abstraction. A fire alarm, I quickly organize it into something, for example, warning or disturbance, okay? I'm not really focusing on the wavelengths and on all the details of that fire alarm. And then I have a wish. Maybe I want to protect myself. I want to do something about it. Emotions, this is a bad thing. This is a dangerous thing. My heart starts to beat faster, and I devise strategies to jump out the window, to yell for help. Do I call the fireman? What do? I devise a strategy. This focuses my attention as I devise my strategy and I'm thinking. I'm not being distracted by every other thought that could occur. I have other information. Where am I in terms of my strategy? Is there a staircase nearby? Can I watch what other people are doing? What have I done in the past? I can abstract all these things together. Like I've got a strategy, I have a thing I want to do, I've got priorities. All these things are happening at once. You could take example after example, and you see that these categories are interacting. You hear a sentence from an opponent, and you abstract a little bit of what they're saying. You don't worry about every little sound. You have a will. Do you wish to agree or disagree with the opponent? That allows you to devise strategies. You have emotions. Maybe you are agreeing for a while what the person says and then strongly disagree. This emotion affects your will. That will affects your strategy, and so on and so forth. You can go back and think about what the person said a couple of minutes ago, maybe try to find a contradiction, try to find the context. Maybe you can find some logic or words that you have used in the past, and you integrate all of this in an abstract general manner. These things are happening rapidly and very, very, very effectively. Here I began saying, suppose you perceive something. Your starting point could be, you're got nothing to do and you start to think to yourself, and you want to do something. You want to maybe understand something that somebody told you, or you want to find a math algorithm. The starting point can be different, but you've got all these components all working together. So let's maybe go through a couple of quick examples and break this down in terms of a process. Let's look for an example where my mind is going to also interact with my brain for some reason. So we start off with something like, what did I experience last year during vacation? Now, this is kind of a very vague general concept at the moment. We don't have the answer yet, but we have a vague. So this has got to be generalized, refined a little bit. We have to distinguish this from, let's say, another question like, what did I experience during my last job interview or during my Christmas holidays? So you got to sort of generalize a little bit. You're restricting the topic. And before you go into the brain, you are in some manner going to have to prepare a search. And this search can be multimedia. My vacation involved what? Various smells, maybe certain songs I heard, imagery of birds or oceans that you saw. It's multimedia. And then here, we're in some manner, this intention, what I wish to find, is got to be formulated in a language, and a search begins, and this goes into the brain. And here, of course, we have the huge mystery of everything ever stored in the brain. How does this search algorithm work? How does it know to find what is relevant for this particular intention? Nobody knows. This is really a very, very extraordinary question. And this we do almost instantly. Sorry. Now, all kinds of signals come back from various circuits, various neurons. And somehow we have this so-called binding problem. From all these lines and colors and everything else, all this has to be in our minds, organized into objects like these particular tones are part of a particular song, or these particular things are part of the bird and not of the water waves. So into a mind representation, organized according to the media. And here comes a rather strange thing. All this now is put together. It looks like we have found something useful in some manner. We have to compare what came back out again with our intention. And incredibly, we're able to say, yeah, that was my vacation. Or, nope, that wasn't it at all. No idea how this works. So we've got a representation here of what we wish to accomplish. And here we have the results of the search. And then this whole thing can be refined several times. The symbol here is just to illustrate that at every step here, the process can be interrupted. Something of higher priority can happen. Maybe we are not interested, or maybe we have something more interesting to consider. And so only if the decision is to continue, we'll continue. Otherwise, and that I show here, the decision could be just kill the whole chain of thought. That's the end of the story, or put it on hold and then continue later. So, and we do so much of this. We can start something one moment, like start humming a song, get interrupted, and continue on the exact correct note a few minutes later. Happy birthday to you. So somehow we're putting it on hold, we're storing it and continuing. So perhaps one or two examples to make this clear. Let's say you have something, a precise fact. You're looking for somebody's name. So you try to remember the name of the guy who set up this session. You go through all these steps, comes back out again, and somehow it comes out Boris. And here, in a manner that nobody understands, we know that Boris was not the result that I intended to find. Here, I do not know what the answer is. Here it comes out, I'm saying either yes or no, that is correct. These are the kinds of things you could not possibly explain with material properties. Or let's say translate between languages. You have something you want to translate from one to the other. First, you've got to convert it into a general concept that is correct. You have to understand the intention, the true meaning goes into the brain. You find the suitable words, the possible meaning that you could use, comes back out again, and you spit it. We do this kind of a thing very, very, very rapidly. And it's incredible how effective that is. Let's say that that somebody asked me to translate something in Spanish like yo estoy perdido. Normally that would be translated in English to I'm lost. For example, I'm in a forest, I'm lost. But perhaps this context, the meaning is I don't understand what you're saying. That would also be correct in Spanish. You'd also say estoy perdido. But you translate it different in English because the intention is different. And somehow the mind has to generalize, refine, understand before going into the brain, and then correctly translate the intended meaning. Absolutely astonishing. To be effective, our minds can also focus and prime. What I mean by that is, let's say that I'm going to I know and I wish to look to the right of me and know what's there, okay? So there's a high level, general way of representing that intention without all the details. I'm structuring what I'm going to do, just like I did in the slide before. And here, before I actually, in a split second, before I look to the right, I am priming. That means in some manner, we are organizing those circuits that could plausibly be relevant to what I'm going to do, which makes things a lot more effective when I do it. Then I decide I'm going to glance to the right. Instructions are given to the motor neurons. Then I physically go, tick, tick. And here, my various sensors provide feedback. and it gives me a series of objects, colors, perhaps also some sound, other things. All of this has got to be converted into relevant elements. This isn't just a blob of photons that hit my retina and a series of electrical charges that came back out again, that converts that into straight lines, a bookcase, a bunch of books, some red colors, that may be a red book, and the things I saw in a split second. And all this then is fed back again. The point here is that if I try to remember what did I glance at 4 seconds ago, a minute ago, an hour ago, chances are I won't remember. And if I just happen to glance like this, I won't remember. But if I know I'm going to glance and wish to glance, then what I see, I can retain far, far better. It's much, much more effective. And so we are in some way preparing and priming those parts of the brain that are going to be working with us. And we know that we can focus our attention. We know that we can listen to one voice in a big crowd of many languages. So these are some of the interesting things that mind can do. So before moving on, just one more slide here. First of all, the brain is very, very plastic. So all the things going on isn't hard coded to only one location. So in some manner, the search algorithms have to know where to look. Huge mystery. I don't even know anybody who's trying to answer how that might work. Big mystery. Now, at the other extreme, some neurons are known to be specialized in very specific details, like sounds like D, P, G, K. These things are recognized when speaking a word by just a few neurons. If those neurons are damaged, these people literally cannot hear those sounds. In fact, that is why you may know that like Chinese people have a lot of trouble hearing like the difference R and L, like lice or rice. They literally don't hear the difference. And they can't if these phonemes are not present. So something in the mind is choosing the right combination of potential neuron circuits in sub-second time. There's some kind of guidance there. It has to be. Look, when we've got, I said 100 billion neurons, or 100 trillion synapses. Think of the combination explosion. Think of all the neurons that could be linked together to form a particular circuit in real time. And all of these with exchange of 60 kinds of neurotransmitters. The combinatorial potential here is so vast. We would never solve any problems without some kind of very precise guidance. So many, many parts of the brain are often involved. In this case, we have the so-called 10 cells. These are involved when reasoning involves emotional aspects. And from the brain imagery, we know that different parts of the brain are active in these kinds of emotional activities, the thalamus, amygdala, and so on and so forth. And all this is integrated here into a coherent concept. So extraordinarily sophisticated. So far, my message is simply, we see the mind doing many, many things. It's organizing, it's guiding, search activities, processes going on in the physical brain. It's providing sensation, all this under the guidance of will, of strategy, of intentionality. We're aware of many things, and this is happening extremely, extremely rapidly. So fast that most people don't give this too much thought because it's simply so natural. They'll say things like, I won't believe it until I see it. They've given no thought about what that means to see something, to perceive something, and to interpret something. There's so much going on there. Quantum mechanics might provide some insights into how the mind could be interacting with the physical. Quantum mechanics is used for many physical things like the burning of stars and how the elements of periodic table form, meaning the different electronic orbitals. The Schrödinger wave equation is a mathematical way of expressing all the possible locations of a particle, where, when, the energy levels in terms of probability. So it's a probability that it will be at a given location at a particular time. So often an electronic orbital is expressed as these sort of wave probability functions. And the higher probability are those regions that we interpret as the location of the electron, and further away from where this orbital should be, that the probability is much, much lower. The so-called Copenhagen interpretation is a way some people interpret all of this. They say that the wave function expresses all the potential answers, but when we are aware or measure or perceive something, a particular possibility then becomes real. So that means the mind plays an active role. Not everybody agrees with this, but there's good reasons to believe that's more than nonsense. You may have heard of the Two Slit Experiment. The take-home message here: when electrons or protons are allowed to shot out from the so-called from a beam gun, it can go through one or two slits, holes. If you just come back after a while and look at the pattern here on this receptor behind the slits, you have an interference pattern. And this is easily explainable by wave type interference here. So, you know, you got some with high concentration where the particles landed, and here low concentration. Now, the interesting thing is, if you put a sensor here and actually observe through which of the two holes is the electron or proton going, then you see what happens here. You end up with totally different. When you see that you are getting things coming out of here, then you see a pattern concentrating in one area. So you actually end up getting two locations here. Complicated, I don't want to get too much detail. The idea is simply that when there is an observer and an intelligence that is some manner observing or measuring, we're getting a different effect. It is somehow guiding the outcome in a different manner than if there was no observer. A very astonishing effect. And this brings us to the idea of the mind being able, through such very small quantum level effects, being able to guide outcomes. So here we're looking at the edge of a vesicle. Very crowded, many proteins. Here you've got a calcium channel, and here's where the vesicles are releasing their neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters here affect the probability of the calcium ion going in the channel, and that affects the probability of the neuron firing and creating a circuit by interacting then with other neurons that can also fire. So the idea is, if memory, activity, perception is related to these firing neurons, and if the mind could affect the probability of these things firing, and there's good reason to think that is very plausible, then we have a way of interacting mind and matter, brain. This is more than just speculation, experiments are showing this very perhaps unexpected behavior, a so-called quantum Zeno effect. There are different examples. Perhaps the easiest one is when you have an ammonia molecule here, this lone pair here fluctuates between the mirror image possibility. Just measuring or observing this can slow down or freeze this interconnection. It's really amazing. On the other hand, is it really so amazing? We do know that we can focus a train of thought. We can hide out pain. We can focus on one conversation in a sea of noise. So mind can choose and mind can affect in many ways. We also know that in various therapies, like obsessive compulsive behavior, it's necessary that the mind be actively part of the therapy. For example, in compulsive behavior, people wash their hands or do other things over and over and over again, even though they know it's foolish and serves no useful purpose. These obsessive thoughts. Now, in the therapies, people can be trained to reinterpret the wish to do these things. They understand and they can perform other activities that are, let's say, less damaging or less foolish, and essentially reroute and retrain these defective neurons. But all of this is only effective if the mind is actively involved. We know that people that, like athletes that visualize certain activities, karate movements, high dive jumpers, things like that, are activating motor circuits. So when they do the movement, it's actually easier and more effective. When people think about clenching a hand, it increases the blood flow in the relevant parts of the brain. It actually does that. In this experiment, people perform a movement, typically with the hand very rapidly, and it's known that about half a second before the hand moves, there is a so-called readiness potential. You see certain parts of the brain that are showing wave behavior. This led some people to think that therefore that wave potential was causing the motion. But other experiments show that's not quite the true story, because people would look at this oscilloscope here, and before that wave potential showed up, like a tenth of a second before, they were aware, I'm about to move my hand. And that is not being recorded anywhere. So that is apparently the will that is preceding the physical action. And they can then, in a split second, say, I decide not to move my hand. So even though you see the readiness potential like before, now suddenly the hand is not moving. And that is a strong indication of a free will, that mind is independent of matter and can affect matter. Pretty cool. I'll skip this example here so we can come to a quick end here, just a few concluding thoughts. Once again, brains, the most complex objects known in the universe. To create them, your neurons go through a very complex set of cellular specialization. That means that certain genes are activated, deactivated, microRNAs are produced to keep things in a stable state. A lot is going on there. Billions of these neurons, all in the right place, all prepared in the right time sequence. Extraordinarily complex. And in some manner, we are able to learn. And learning is not a trivial matter. We don't learn the way we train neural networks. Neural networks are mechanical. That means we know what we want the outcome to be. see, maybe I'll take a minute to explain this here. Let's say in this particular example here that I have a classification problem. I want to classify photographs. Every time one sees a photograph, this program must say cat, cat, dog, cat, cow, horse, cat. This is an outcome, one outcome, only one outcome. So you feed in photographs. The photographs have pixels, red, green, blue pixels. That's the input. You've got these so-called hidden layers with these different nodes here. And what's happening here is things like lines and other elements are deduced based on the input, and they're combined. And all this is used to predict an outcome. Now, the computer doesn't know what a cow is. All it knows is that when various combinations of inputs are provided, it says variable A, variable, variable B, variable C as the outcome. It has no idea. But all of this is purely mechanical. All that's happening is we have the algorithms that try to provide the right parameter values here. And by trial and error, then the mathematicians decide how many hidden layers do they want to experiment, how many nodes, what kinds of feed-forward, feedback algorithms. All this is basically trial and error. You provide a few million photographs, and indeed, when you provide one that wasn't seen before, it can say with a high probability of being correct that is a dog. But kids don't have that. They have no way of knowing that this is a cow. They're supposed to learn that this is a cow, but there's nothing saying to a brain recognize that this is a particular element, that this is good, this is bad, this is hot, whatever. So we really don't understand how learning works. So one final slide. So just suppose that you wish to do something for the first time. You wish to search for a complex memory of something that you had not searched for before. Or you want to find a solution to a problem you've never attempted before, a chess problem or a crime solution. Or you experience something like being in love for the very, very first time, etc., etc. Somehow your mind must guide all of the neuron firing to produce irrelevant circuits. And you must be able to perceive the right sensation. These are the kinds of things that natural mindless processes simply cannot explain. That was my final thought.